Hello and welcome to the latest online event from Inspire Workplaces. It's good to be back on this quite dismal February day in England. I hope it's sunnier and warmer and brighter where you are. 8 days until the deadline for Top Inspiring Workplaces, the awards all over the world. So February the 21st is your deadline for that if you're already working on your submission or just think you should be entering and want to get cracking with it right now. You do still have over a week to go. Let's get straight to it today. We've got a really, really exciting webinar for you. 2024 Trends for Modern Employee Listening and Survey Strategy. The overview is, while our companies relentlessly pursue greater customer satisfaction and product or service improvement, there's a pivotal aspect that often doesn't receive the same dedicated attention: our people. In the face of a dramatically transformed workforce, a modern employee voice and survey strategy is indispensable for fostering an environment where employees are not only engaged, but also inspired. Couldn't agree more. This session emphasizes the critical need for HR leaders and companies to harness a strategy for gathering employee feedback and initiating actions that contribute to the creation of superior employee experiences. Taking us through this session today is the brilliant Rob Catalano. Those familiar with Inspiring Workplaces will also be very familiar with him. He's one of our top influencers over many years, Chief Engagement Officer at WorkTango, and he's also WorkTango's co-founder and Chief Strategy Officer, and spent the last 18 years building HR technology and advisory companies. He was also on the founding team at Achievers, where he spent 10 plus years growing the organization. And his passion for improving the employee experience has led him to co-found WorkTango in 2015. I think you'll see his passion come through in this session. I see it every time we talk. It's definitely, I think, probably both our life's mission to help deliver an enhanced employee experience for people. So without further ado, let's welcome Rob to the session. Hello, Rob.
Hello, Matt. Hello. Thank you so much for having me. How are you?
Very well, thank you. Very well. Good seeing you again. And without further ado, I'm just going to hand over to you and let you do your thing.
Sounds good. Well, hello, everyone. I am excited to be here. You're right, Matt. When you think about life missions, when I started WorkTango, we wanted to create a passion statement, not a mission statement, because missions end. And that passion is to improve work lives. So it's something I'm super passionate about. My goal today is to take 20 years of working, building HR technology companies, being an HR leader, being a people leader, even being a CEO, into what I've seen in terms of how companies are leveraging strategies like employee listening to drive better cultures and better workplaces. I'm joining you today from Toronto. I don't know what Matt's talking about. When I lived in the UK, it was always sunny, but I guess it's not as warm today. It's actually snowing out here. So I've noticed a bit out the window, but really excited to be here with you all today. Now, I am super passionate about this, but one other thing I'm also passionate about is music. So I always like to infuse music, as you can see from this background, into my talks, and you'll kind of see that theme as we go through, right? It's okay to combine multiple passions. But what I do want to start with, to kind of get everyone going and start with an interesting story, is actually start with this slide. You're probably wondering where this is going, but you recognize these people, right? And they have something in common beyond being famous musicians, right? And I know what you're thinking. 100%, that looks like John Travolta in Grease, right? Steven Tyler, I can't get out of my head. Every time I show this slide, it's the one thing I think about. But I bring up the story because these aren't just famous singers. They actually hold the record in the recording studio for the widest vocal range at around 6 octaves. And if you know anything about music, that's really, really impressive. And you know these people, right? They're famous. But I bet you don't know this man. This is Tim Storms. He actually holds the Guinness record for the widest vocal range at 10 octaves. He crushes them all. And I know what you're thinking. Rob, what does this have to do with employee voice? Well, I like to tell 2 stories to make the connection. The first, there's a range of voices in our organizations that we just don't hear from, right? We typically hear the loudest person in the room, right? And we forget that there's people under the radar that have a wider range of opinions than the popular opinion, right? Or there's people like there at Tim that we're not even aware of, that they have great feedback and great insights, right? We listen to the popular opinion in the room. That's the first reason I bring up this story. The second is that we're so stuck in what we know that we don't change our approach. And that's not okay in the workplace, but it's okay with music. So, a quick sidebar, I don't know about you, but from a music perspective, I'm guilty. I listen to the same albums over the last 4 or 5 decades, right? I listen to the same Metallica and CNC Music Factory cassettes. Yes, if you're wondering what that is, it's a cassette. We've evolutionized over the years, but I'm just I'm dating myself perhaps, but in the spirit back to what we're talking about, um, it's okay to not change your music preferences, but you have to change the way that we're conducting things in our organizations. And companies are guilty of this when they use the annual engagement survey as the predominant way to understand employee sentiment in their organizations, right? It's too infrequent, right? Once a year. It's too isolated to one experience, right? And again, it's not a complete employee experience, which is what we're trying to prove. And what's amazing to me is this was actually invented over 100 years ago in the World War. I'm not kidding. Literally something that was invented over 100 years ago is how companies today are still using as the predominant way to listen to employees and build better employee experiences. So we need to start changing our approach, right, with a modern approach to employee listening. So what I want to talk about today, really to kind of frame the discussion, is first why employee voice is important and why it matters. Right? I want to level set the discussion and make sure maybe you're not a believer. Why is listening to employees important? Talk a bit about that. Second, the evolution of employee voice and how it's changing. I've seen companies go through this journey of taking the one time a year or once every 5 years listening to employees into a more solid strategy. So I want to leave you with some evolution of how it's changing, but I want to get prescriptive, right? What have I seen as 5 trends and how companies are really shifting this strategy? And lastly, 4 examples and mindsets to leave you with. It's great to have an approach and a strategy, but after talking to so many HR leaders over the years and having them reflect on how they changed their strategy, I reflected back on what mindsets really mattered to them, right? And I wanted to bring that into the conversation today. So before I get into all of this, there's one question I always ask when it comes to these types of sessions. And the question is, who cares? By the way, there's no better picture to depict who cares than this. I always joke that AI is kind of impressive, but what really impresses me is when I type who cares into Google, this comes up, right? There's no picture that shows who cares better than this. And I could spend all day talking about the data, the research, why we should care about this topic. But I'm going to save you that and just share a couple of data points for people that may not be the believers, as I mentioned, right? Maybe you're not sure why this is critical and why we should lean in and listen to the conversation today. So 2 quick items. First, companies that actively listen to employees and act accordingly are 12 times more likely to engage and retain employees, right? I don't have to tell you the impact of engagement on your organization and your bottom line or the retention, right? The relationships that are kept, intellectual knowledge, let alone the cost of rehiring for folks and training them, right? So again, it has huge impact, a lot of data out there. Also, 88% of employees whose companies financially outperform competitors feel heard. Only 62% of employees at underperforming companies feel. That's a 42% difference. And that's what we want, right? We want high performing organizations that start with people. So that's another reason why you should care. Last reason why you should care, and this doesn't have anything to do with data and statistics, but there was a recent research study from Gartner that showed the top priorities for 2024. And you're looking at the screen and you're seeing those top 5, you've been seeing the ones, 6 to 10. And the reality is we have to navigate through this in 2024. And the only way you can navigate to success when you're trying to understand leader and manager development or org culture or change management or so on is you have to listen to your employees, right? Unless you understand what's working and what isn't, it'll be very, very challenging to navigate to find a successful employee experience with what you really care for. And if you look at the outside of that circle, unsettled relationships, skills shortages, transformative technologies, pressure for operational efficiency, all this other stuff is happening where it becomes so much more critical to be really tuned in to our employees and understanding them. So that's a big reason why you should care. So hopefully, I'm off the soapbox. You're on here already on this session. So hopefully this matters and you're interested in learning more. So that's what I want to dive into. 5 modern employee voice trends that companies are doing. And I kind of structured into a way that can provide you some insight, but also some prescriptive takeaways as well. So we'll start with the first one, right? First, companies need to be more agile, and they're starting to do so and seeing success. And if you're wondering what this is my combination of music with Marty McFly from Back to the Future. But again, we have to think about the future. We can't think about the past, right? That annual survey we've been doing, for decades isn't going to work anymore. And what I mean by HR agility is that it's the ability of moving quickly, right? It's being responsive, it's being nimble, and effectively managing change. And guess what? Our organizations are changing now more than ever. And why this is important, back to the point I made earlier about Gartner's top objectives and all of your objectives in your organization, it's the fact that success isn't linear. We all have our definition of success, but it's going to change. It could be outside factors like COVID. It could be things happening in our own organization. It could be the market. But the reality is we have to listen to employees to navigate our way to that success. And I don't know if we're so used to, thinking of the world in annual practices because that's what we used to do back in the day, reporting to CFOs, or we're just used to doing what we've done. But the reality is that successful companies have evolutionized their approach to employee listening. And this has been going on for a while, right? It's not often I show data from 4 or 5 years ago, but even 4 years ago, 5 years ago, companies were starting to have an intersect in the dark blue of doing an annual survey to collecting other data to build better experiences, right? Think about that, right? If we aren't thinking about this today, we're 4 or 5 years behind what organizations are doing in their company. And what's exciting is that I spent years spending time and effort in helping organizations make this evolution. And the evolution has typically started with this annual survey that I mentioned, and then it moved over to pulse surveys. However, pulses are typically just the same survey more often, right? People get complacent, they tune out. But the real modern trend in this agility motion is what I call active listening. Right? Active listening is not just measuring engagement, it's the whole employee life cycle, right? And the one magic about this concept of active listening is that you have to get beyond measurement, right? Yes, employee listening and your engagement survey is not just about measurement, right? Not only do you have to be more frequent in hearing the voice of your employees and maybe measuring things like engagement, but the critical factor is you need the frequency combined with what I call diagnostic feedback, right? Diagnostic feedback. What's happening in your company? What feedback from employees can identify what's working and what isn't? What feedback can you get from them to understand if you're going to launch something new, what's working and what isn't, right? So this concept of agility comes from higher frequency combined with your diagnostic feedback and your measurement. And when companies ask, well, how do you make this a reality? I have organizations I work with all the time that take this concept of taking your annual survey, for example, and maybe breaking it up into monthly or quarterly objectives. And you can still measure things. Measuring's okay, but it's really about that diagnostic feedback, right? You don't need 30 questions to understand if people feel recognized at work. You need one. And if that's poor, dig into concerning feedback, right? Dig to clarify, hey, we wanted to understand why people have sentiment is a certain way, right? Understand sentiment on change. We just changed something in the company. What works? What doesn't? Now we can be agile if it's not working and we didn't hit the mark. Get employee feedback in advance or even open-ended feedback. So I bring up this idea, and I like this image because what it kind of identifies is if we really want to get to active listening, you have to increase your frequency, but it has to be beyond measurement in that diagnostic space. Now, every time I talk about agility and reaching out to employees and getting that feedback more frequently, people roll their eye and they say, oh, what about survey fatigue? And the reality is there's no such thing as survey fatigue. There's lack of action fatigue. I work with organizations over the last decade where they've tuned in not only quarterly or monthly, maybe even bi-weekly, maybe even weekly. Heck, some do it daily. But the reality is your employees will give you feedback if things change, right? If there's movement in that feedback. Now, people are reasonable, right? They know that you can't solve everything. But again, having those open conversations keep people aligned. And if you don't believe me, Josh is looking nice and dapper here, but how he explains it, you cannot maintain positive employee experience without listening to your people on a continuous basis. I know you're thinking, yeah, Rob, I get it, nothing new, but I speak to a lot of HR leaders that still struggle to convince their companies that it's important and critical to get more frequent and conduct those efforts at the end of the day. Which leads me to my next trend. That next trend is companies really need to start leveraging and accepting new technology. Right? Technology, and you're seeing it not just in employee listing, but across your HR and company world. It's making it easier for companies to find more value in whatever you're trying to accomplish. right? So with your employee survey strategy or your employee voice strategy, technology is definitely supporting simplicity, speed, and number of other items I want to share here today. So one good example, right? I spoke to 20 different companies I've had the pleasure of working with, and I asked, before you started implementing technology, how long did it take you to get from listening to your employees, just using a survey? And I like using survey because that's a base initiative that many companies know and understand.
Hey everybody, I think Rob is having some technical difficulties. I think his internet might have cut out briefly. I know there was a slight challenge ahead of the session, so I think that might have eventuated. Nothing like doing something live, and technology sometimes can create pressures and problems. So this is one of those right now. So for now, you can listen to, you've got me and or that screen. Lots already covered off by Rob, especially talking about modern approach, being more agile, leveraging new technologies, and I'm hoping we get to hear the other key trends that he's going to talk us through. Just anecdotally, whilst we're here waiting for Rob to come back, talking about modern approaches and how we're in a rapidly dynamic, changing environment with regards to the world of work. I was hopefully going to do an internship for one of my family in France who's currently studying at university, and they needed to be over here for 2 months. What I suggested was that we could do it for 1 month here and then 1 month remotely. And being a very modern university, they've said that they don't allow internships that involve remote work. So I'm glad we're preparing our future workforce in the right way. Understanding that there is actually remote work, especially office-based environments. So I think that Rob might be coming back. So definitely want to listen to him, not me. So Rob is back and unfrozen. So Rob, we're talking about leveraging new technologies, I believe, and you just got going on that. So I will let you continue.
Yes. Again, apologies, everyone. I had the wonderful opportunity of living in downtown Toronto, where construction happens quite rampant around the space. So we had some issues this morning. Tried something else, and still seems to be struggling. So my apologies, and we'll hopefully dive right in without any further hiccups and issues. But again, I appreciate you playing support there, Matt, while I was out. But getting back to where I was going, and apologies if there was an issue from not seeing the lead up to this slide, but the basic concept of technology being required in this world of improving employee listening strategy. What it does is it helps bring that time from actually listening, understanding, and acting on feedback down dramatically. So when I speak to organizations out there, and this is just a collection of 20 companies I spoke to, is just implementing technology got 6 times more efficient from actually getting feedback from folks to acting at the end of the day. And I'm using surveys as an example that many people understand, have had experience before. But it's not just speed that technology offers, it offers a number of other things as well. Examples, the ability to share what insights are happening when employees are filling out their feedback, right? Imagine the impact when employees get to see what they're thinking versus the rest of their colleagues. That's just one example. Another example, right? I don't know how many people here that are old music fans like I am, and they have to read all the lyrics on the side of that cassette tape. But it's hard to read all of that, just like it's hard to read thousands of comments from our employees, right? So technology makes that happen right away. How do you look at themes and sentiment of what people are thinking and feeling? If management big and red captures your eye, let's dig into what that looks like and what people are talking about management. Now, again, the other thing too is surveys. They used to be a one-way conversation, right? What if technology allowed companies to do if you see a concerning comment or issue that people have? The ability to look at interacting with employee comments, right? Technology can now have people confidentially have conversations with employees to dig in, to get more information, or maybe to curate and crowdsource what ideas other employees like. So as you can see, again, technology has that ability to not only look at information, but interact with it in unique ways. Now, last thing is it wouldn't be an HR session without talking about AI. And I mentioned earlier I'm in Toronto, so I am obliged to either talk about hockey in my sessions or Drake. So if you haven't seen the AI Drake song, it is actually really really good. I like it. But when it comes to AI, think of what AI is doing. And again, people say it's coming. Well, we all know it's here. But in that concept of listening, understanding, and act, right? AI is really helping identify bias in questions, right? To democratize the ability to get feedback, auto translate in companies' work language and use things specific to you. From an understanding perspective, summarizing the insights, right? Like I mentioned, or highlight what anomalies or trends are happening from a data perspective. Even from an act perspective, how do you recommend actions and the influence of those actions to leaders in your company or deliver curated learning experiences? And again, there's a lot of really great technology that's helping improve not only the speed, but even the other examples I've mentioned earlier around building employee listening into an actual actionable world from a better employee experience perspective. So I always ask folks is like, what are you using in your organizations from a technology perspective? Forget about employee listening, but are you looking at new ways to drive success? Right? Are you looking at things like Chat GPT to try to help you build speed and insights in a different way? And I show this image. This is a good example of what Walmart did. Right? They actually use VR to help train employees when they have to, they call it the wet wall. So when you have to actually water the wet wall in Walmart, this used to be an 8-hour training process. It's 15 minutes now. I think of the impact and speed from that. So the point I make is, are you researching these types of technologies not only for employee listening, but across the whole employee life cycle? And I read once that it's an automated world and HR is living in it. We should be driving it at the end of the day, right? So ask yourself, what is your HR tech strategy for the next year, for the next 3 years, for the next 5 years, right? Coming up for air and thinking about that, especially at the rapid changes in our organization, is so critical. So that's a second trend. The third trend, and I've seen companies lean into this probably the most and seeing success, is they're leveraging their secret weapon, which is the leaders and managers in companies. I'm sorry, but I feel bad for managers because let's face it, they're the face of our antiquated HR practices, right? Here's data from a survey once a year that's 3 months stale. Hey, sit your employees in a room and give them a rating out of 3 because that's supposed to encapsulate their performance in the organization, right? So again, we put them in situations where they can't be successful. So this concept of leveraging your secret weapons, ask yourself a really, really serious question. Are your managers tools? Again, I'm joking, but not so much, right? Are they great tools that can drive success of your employees? Or are they just a tool? And I looked up the definition of tool. It says a fool that is characterized by low confidence and low self-esteem, right? But that's a stigma our managers have in organizations because we're not enabling them. If you don't believe me, believe Google. I typed in my manager and look at what I got. Is toxic, hates me, doesn't like me. in French. I mentioned I'm in Canada. Ignores me, harassing me, incompetent. There's a show I have to watch. Was rude to me. And at the bottom right, it said report inappropriate predictions. And this is all inappropriate. This is the stigma that our leaders and managers have in our organizations. So the reality, my ask of everyone is, how are you enabling them with tools, not creating tools in your company? And what I mean by enabling is, are we enabling them with the technology? Are we enabling them with real-time data from an employee listening perspective? Are we enabling them from better process of not doing it once a year and having more listening to help support success of their teams and ultimately your organization? And back to employee listening and employee voice, one of the most rapidly growing trends and what great companies are doing and seeing huge impact on, and my advice to you is, HR, don't be a filter. Filters are cute for music celebrities, but not in the workplace. It is amazing to me how many companies I see will get employee feedback, surveys, focus groups, you name it, and they won't share the data with leaders, right? Or, hey, we'll do the survey, we'll give you the data, but we won't show you the verbatim comments. Like, they are supposed to be your leaders. We ask our leaders to get feedback and give feedback to employees day in and day out, but we hold the data in HR. And the reality is leaders have the biggest influence on creating great employee experiences, and they need to understand what employees feel and look like. And guess what? If they don't like the information, they have to change accordingly. And if you hold it from them, you're just going to see the same activities and characteristics repeated over and over. So again, my advice, give employee feedback to every single leader for their teams. And when you do that, it builds trust, right? It also adds accountability to act, right? When people are getting feedback and little nudges of what's working and what isn't, it does support their actions and how they conduct themselves moving forward. In fact, I just talked about technology, or there's technology that nudge leaders with recommended actions based on that type of feedback as well. So that's the third trend. Fourth trend I want to talk about is the fact that companies are making use of insights and not data. So think about it. If you have more agility and you're getting more feedback, right, and more speed of that data getting to you, right? But you also have technology to look at it in different ways. Now companies are set up to leverage the insights in just new ways that were impossible before. And gone should be the days of making sense of this, right? Usually when I'm speaking in person, I ask people to raise their hand if this is still how they look at employee voice data or other HR data, and then many people's hands go up. And then when we can't make sense of this, right, we give it to the data Excel wizard in our company. So hopefully they live in HR, but if they don't, we're probably, tapping their shoulder on other parts of the organization. But the reality is, the technology and agility is now giving way to real-time dashboards, real site insights, right? It's quicker to get information. There's less human error. It's more confidential when you think about employee feedback. But I want to share a quick example with you what I'm talking about when it comes to insights versus data. So this is just a hypothetical example, but and I don't know how the journey of everyone here, right? Maybe you're just getting started. Maybe you're super sophisticated when it comes to leveraging data and people analytics. But I get the pleasure of working with hundreds of companies, big, small, global, but surprisingly, many companies are still conducting this example I'm going to mention here when I meet them. So they get their data from an engagement survey, what you see on the screen. What do? They focus on the bottom scores. And by focus, I mean, hey, let's create action plans corporately around them. Let's change the quarterly objectives to make sure we hit those things. But they miss out on leveraging data in more insightful ways. So for example, there's much more you could be doing and what companies are starting to do, which is just simple correlative analysis. Right? Regression models can help tell a company where to spend your efforts to see the biggest impact. Right? As I mentioned earlier, you can't solve all the world's problems in one quarter or 1 year. So it's our jobs, right, from a people perspective and HR perspective, to look at these types of analyses, to understand, because we can't do all of these things, what are the things that have the biggest influence or impact on driving engagement or better sense of belonging or whatever you're measuring in your company, right? And you can be more predictive of where to spend that type of effort. Right? So again, there's just simple data models, but again, companies are understanding that these new methods and opportunities are available. And quite frankly, many organizations aren't leaning on that type of data and insights as well today, as they should be. Now, another way of using insights and not data is this concept of what I say, avoid insights in isolation. And you might be wondering why Beethoven, why are you trying to shove in another music reference? But Beethoven first discussed concept of isolation in the early 1800s, and especially being deaf, he was challenged personally and It's a very interesting read if you get a chance. So I'll get off the music train for a sec. But the thing that companies are prioritizing today is ensuring employee voice data is not in a vacuum and correlated with other insights you have in the organization. Right? You're not just looking at your employee survey and insights data. You're looking at other data in the company that you can correlate to. But I want to share just a simple example of what I mean. And I'll use the idea of the engagement survey and a DE&I survey, right? Most companies have done these in some capacity. So what I mean by that, you do your DEI survey and you realize, hey, if I look at different underrepresented groups, I understand there's some organizations or some parts of the organization that feel really positive or feel really negative from a sentiment perspective. And this is just a simple analysis we're used to seeing. But let's say we layered on the DE&I data with employee engagement data like ENPS. It tells a more impactful story, right? Many people may not understand the influence of feel like your inclusion or belonging, especially if you're in a group that, feels like you're included and belonging all the time, right? But just different ways of looking at your data with the same data set kind of gives another level of just insight and layers to look at the data more critically. And again, technology is obviously making this easier. Now, I'll get off the data train in a moment, but the one last piece of advice I wanted to share, and it's one that I received a long time in my career ago and relating to data, and I still take it with me, day in and day out, is this concept of what's called the art of data. And to give you the quick story, my boss at the time said, Rob, if you don't have the art of data, it's like, don't even come to the table. And I didn't really know what that meant, right? Okay, the art of data. Can you add more context? He's like, art, right? Art is an acronym: absolute, relative, and trend. I was still kind of unsure where he was going with it. But basically what he said, Rob, if you give data in an absolute, the A, and it's in isolation, it has no context or no real evidence, right, to do anything with. So think about that, right? Think if you had your engagement score and it was 65. All right, that absolute number 65 is kind of useless, right? But when it's relative, right, maybe it's 65 compared to another organization from a benchmark perspective or one of our partner organizations, now you can kind of get a sense of, oh, well, that's the art part. It's relative. Maybe it's good. Maybe it's not so good. And the T is trend. So if it was 85 last quarter, wow, that trend is going down dramatically. But maybe it was 45. And we're seeing huge impacts going from 45 to 65. So this concept of the art of data, making sure it's absolute, relative, and trend worthy, is really, really important anytime you're sharing data, whether it has to do with employee listing or not. So my hope is to impart some knowledge I've received and things that have helped me in my career to all of you. I know you're thinking, Rob, this picture has nothing to do with music, it's art, but it actually is someone out there pulls all these musical scores and take different instruments and represents them by different colors and puts them on this cool graph. So this is actually a piece by Mozart, and I thought I'd bring some more music into the conversation. So that being said, that's the fourth trend. The last trend, surveys aren't the only way to do this. Many organizations, unfortunately, again, use that one survey as example as their predominant way to understand employee sentiment and measure it and get feedback. But companies are definitely looking at new methods to hear the voice of employees, or I like to say, turn their employee voice initiatives up to 11. So the fun and the music references do not stop. But what I thought the easiest way to share concepts of different types of employee voice strategies initiatives was to share everything on one slide. So I like taking complex ideas and putting into one screen to try and help navigate through vast ideas and strategies. But there's three ways to look at employee voice data sources. On the left side, solicited versus unsolicited, right? I'm asking you for employee feedback, or unsolicited, I'm taking it, right? We'll talk about some examples. The second, which you see at the bottom there, is structured versus unstructured, right? Structured data is very easily organized. It's formatted in a way that you can search for it in databases. But unstructured, there's no format, there's no organization, right? Really difficult to collect or process or analyze, right? So we'll talk about there's concepts there we have to think about in our employee voice and employee listening strategy. And at the top, these are basically the maturity stage at most organizations. Now, some companies might still be in the traditional bucket. You might look at this and say, Rob, I'm an emerging. Great, you're doing good things, right? But my goal is to give you insight into what's available to you as you think about your employee voice strategy, the data that can help you collect. So to give you a few examples in color, I'm not going to go through every item on the page, but send these slides and you could definitely leverage this. But when it comes to traditional, companies are still solicited census engagement surveys or 360s, once a year, right? From an unstructured perspective, right? Focus groups, one-on-ones, right? Again, digging deeper into some of the data and having conversations versus those type of surveys. And that's great. I've seen a lot of companies doing that for decades. But then you think about unsolicited, right? There's companies out there that are looking at location tracking, right? Maybe you're looking at the effectiveness routes for drivers in the field, or maybe data, whether people are working from home or not. Maybe there's some insights there in terms of how they're impacting their goals or correlating it with other data points. Or things that are unstructured is just like computer use monitoring, right? Maybe you're just trying to understand operational efficiency or which applications people use the most to achieve their work goals. But these are all just ideas of and examples of employee listening to collect data to help build a better experience at the end of the day, which is what we're all after. So again, looking at this matrix when it's done, you can kind of take stock of what we might be doing, what we might not be doing. But traditionally, a lot of organizations have lived in this left side. From a developing perspective, that's when people start getting into pulse surveys or performance check-ins, some of the stuff we've talked about already. Right? Then from an unstructured perspective, exit discussions, stay discussions. Let's understand, why you're still here or why you left. Again, another form of employee voice. But when it comes to the unsolicited side, again, I have the pleasure of working in the recognition space a lot too, day in and day out, especially with Worktango. But employee voice sharing and amplifying who's conducting the right behaviors or who's living values, that's insightful data, right? In terms of identifying possible promotions or who are the people that are conducting the things that are going to help our company be successful. And it's not just about people who are getting recognized, but how about the people who are recognizing others? When I have that data, I'm understanding, hey, are these future leaders in our organization, right? That type of recognition and intrinsic motivation are natural occurrences of leaders. So if I can understand that data, that helps potentially make some decisions from that perspective. Again, it's structured. We're not asking for it, but it's data that we're using to understand employee sentiment and voice and leverage it in a different way. Or at the bottom, when you think about unstructured data, right? Again, call recordings or web chats, right? Maybe you're recording calls from customers or contact centers, right? You can use that data for other purposes as well. And the last idea is what's more emerging. So we talked a little bit about active listening today, and employee life cycles, and what I call development check-ins, right? Performance check-ins are, we're going to check in once a year, once a quarter, and give you a rating. Development check-ins are, conversations around success of that employee. Or more unstructured, like collaborative events or chatbots, right? Looking at conversations to understand sentiment, and all the way down to the unsolicited, right? Wearable devices. Like you can detect early signs of stress as a form of employee listening, or internal chat or external social data. What are people saying on Slack? What are they saying on Glassdoor? So again, there's different concepts here that I wanted to share just to whet your appetite. I know we don't have a ton of time to go through them all, but my goal in all this was just to add color to different options you have, different things at your disposal. Some have pros and some has cons, but again, good flavor to what to consider in a more holistic employee voice strategy. So as a quick recap, agility is key, right? More frequency and diagnostic feedback is critical, right? More than just measuring employee happiness. Leveraging and accepting new technologies allows things to happen rapidly from a speed perspective, but unique ways to do different things with that information. Your leaders are your linchpin to success at the end of the day, and sharing what you've learned from an agility and technology perspective, the data, and obviously what we talked about of all the methods to hear your employee voice and turn it up to 11. So what I mentioned is I was going to share the 5 trends, but I also was going to lean on to wrap us up some mindsets to start with. And again, I get the pleasure of working with so many companies that I reflect back on when you changed your employee listening strategy 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years ago. What was the right mindset that got you to success? And what I did is compiled those conversations and came up with a couple of themes. First thing that came up a lot was using consumer principles, right? And the idea, I love this this picture, but this is what we feel like as consumers, right? We're humans before we're employees. We feel like we should have levels of service that we should have, not just outside of the workplace, but in the workplace. And the reality is, is companies are taking what we do for our customers and saying, how do we relate that to what we do for our employees when it comes to building success of our organizations, right? I love this from Gartner. They talked about many years ago about look at all the things we do from a customer relationship system perspective. Customer engagement, personalized, contextualized marketing to our customers. You know it. You know when you get a personalized message or a mass message, right? You kind of tune out. Customer listening, sentiment analysis, loyalty programs, service and support our customers so they'll never leave. Well, why aren't we doing the exact same things for our talent? Or that mindset and talking to your go-to-market team or your sales team or your marketing team can talk about, well, how can we get employee engagement? How can we get more personalized, contextual discussions with our employees? How do we reward and recognize them? How do we service and support our employees so they never leave, right? So that's one concept of just using consumer principles is a really good way to think about employee voice from a mindset perspective on what we might be doing on our customer side that could work from our employee side, right? A lot of people ask me for specific examples of that and think about Net Promoter Score, right? 10 years ago, it was created by Bain and Company around, how do we understand one question to know if customers would recommend buying from that organization again or recommend that organization to a friend? I mean, I use that day in and day out with customers. Would you recommend this as a place to work? Right? There's huge correlation to just understanding sentiment there to all other engagement measurements that exist out there. So again, that's the first major mindset that I think is critical to start with. The second is remembering the types of employee voice, right? So if you're going to listen to your employees, there's two different types. First is what I call workplace satisfaction or dissatisfaction, right? What's the extent, right, that employees are happy or discontent with their experience, right? You get a lot of that information when it comes to engagement scores or DEI indices or so on. However, what's critical, the second, is what I call participative management. What's the extent to which employees have input into the decision-making process? That isn't engagement being done to them, it's engagement being done with the organization. Right, think about it, right? When you're asked as an employee how you feel, that's different than how would you fix it? What would you do differently, right? Back to some of that diagnostic feedback, it's a really good mindset to know this kind of breaks you out of just measurement at the end of the day. Think about, if you're an engineering company or a lot of technical folks in your organizations, for decades, they've been doing retrospectives, right? Let's sit down and we launch a product. What worked, what didn't? What are we going to do differently? These types of conversation are a really critical factor in the employee voice formula. So again, not just what they feel, but what they would do differently. That's a second mindset. Third mindset, if you're going to listen to your employees, your process must be inclusive, right? And I love this concept of all, right? All for one for all. But one, is it accessible? So is it available for people that may or may not have technology or have accessibility requirements? Two is language. And I'm not talking about global languages, but I work with organizations that have different reading levels in the company, right? Are you getting sentiment of employees by using language that people can relate to or understand? Or even what I call limitations. For example, right? I work with a lot of municipalities or healthcare. There are people in that organization that they work a month on, a month off. And then you launch your survey and they don't have the opportunity to give you feedback. I know these are small nuances, but if you really want to be inclusive, thinking about that as your process and making sure everyone has the opportunity to provide their feedback and have their voice heard, it's a critical part of the equation. And many people that have had that mindset and built it in got a lot of buy-in and respect from the organization to understand that they really mean it, right? They do want to hear the voice of all their employees. So that's that mindset. Another mindset, HR needs data to make decisions. I'm done with the whole HR needs, to see the table. We have it. We have the technology and the ability to start collecting data, but we definitely need more data to make decisions. And when I talked to a bunch of HR leaders and they came in with that mindset, working with their other executives or other teams with that concept that says, listen, if we really want to drive better people experiences that drive success of the company, we're going to need more data. So we have to be more frequent, right? We have to dig in a little further. And what's interesting to me is that if anyone, you probably recognize this, Google's Rework initiative. If you don't, look it up. But this was really popularized over the last decade. Google did a bunch of research to identify what makes great leaders, great successful teams. And again, it was just, it was really groundbreaking data at the time that it came out. But when you look at under the covers of what the foundation of Google Rework was, the Project Oxygen was around performance rating, employee feedback through surveys, and great manager nominations. Great manager nominations is a form of feedback, right? It's recognizing folks for great work. That idea I was talking about earlier of leveraging different data sets. What was Project Aristotle? We had actual metrics and performance and feedback from employees. So again, too often we don't think about the impact and influence of employee feedback has. And this is just an example that we need more data. And some of the popular work out there that everyone's, was enamored with when it came out was really a big part of it was around getting feedback from your teams on what's working and what isn't and how their experiences could be better. So those are the 4 mindsets. Use consumer principles. Remember the types of employee voice. Your process must be inclusive, and HR needs to make data decisions. So before I wrap up here, I'm happy to answer any questions or chat with Matt, but I want to leave you with 2 last things. First is a kind of a bonus mindset that's really critical to have, and second is a bit of a framework that you can use and take from this slide and have good conversations, with your team or yourself on what side of the coin you're at in terms of some of the traditional ways companies are doing things versus the modern ways. So I'll end with those 2 items. So first one, if anyone knows what this is what's called the service profit chain. Is the idea that employees, when they're doing great things, will provide great customer experiences, and customers will love their experience and they'll tell others and they'll come back more. And if that happens, that will turn into shareholder value, or however you define success to your company, profitability, sales, you name it. But the interesting mindset, and I think most critical one that successful companies have, is this concept of customer satisfaction and shareholder value. Those are outputs. You can't change those tomorrow, but what you can influence, the only thing you can influence are the inputs, which is what employees do every day, right? The processes they have, the products they build, the services they provide, right? And again, when you think about employee listening, unless you understand their experiences and optimize for what they can do to succeed, not until then, right? The only thing we can influence, which are those inputs, that you start seeing successful customer sat, successful company growth, right? It all starts with employees at the end of the day, or a really critical mindset. And the last thing I want to share, what I'd mentioned high level, is just a framework to start with, right? I always find it's great to just reflect on where you are today and help be honest with, where you might be in the process to define, what changes might be required. So when I work with a lot of companies, for example, in 2024, is sitting down and saying, where do you sit on this spectrum, right? The left-hand side, traditional employee voice approaches, the right-hand side, more modern trends. Are you once a year versus active listening? Are you just measuring engagement versus the entire employee life cycle and diagnostic feedback? Are you just measuring satisfaction versus getting feedback around participative management? Is it manual and delayed versus real time? Is HR the filter? Are you transparent to all leaders and employees? Are you just thinking about the past, right? Versus forward-looking feedback versus what people did versus what they would do? Are you listening only, or are you actually doing something with that data? And are you looking at vanity metrics like, hey, people responded to our survey versus output measures, engagement and attrition? And if you sit down again with yourself and your team and say, hey, where are we? Like, are we on the left side, the right side? It's a good summary of the conversation today. And I think the best amalgamation of a lot of the trends I've seen over time to say the folks that are doing things on the right are seeing a lot of success, but a good reflection to see if your organization or your team are doing things as well. And guess what? If you can't get your company to get there, try doing it with just your team, right? Start correlating. Maybe that art of data, maybe your team is suddenly up and to the right and everyone's asking so many questions on retention and why that's great or why engagement's great. You can answer that was definitely a different employee listening strategy and approach. So with that being said, thank you. Again, I failed as a musician, so this is the best I get to a live audience. I love connecting with leaders and HR folks. So if you wanted to connect on LinkedIn, you could definitely scan those or find me there. But I appreciate and thank you, and in the spirit of recognition, inspiring workplaces. Right, you're waving the same flag that I know I am and care about, and building great workplaces. And appreciate the opportunity for me to be here. Thank you all for joining. And again, thank you for dealing with some technology issues earlier, and hopefully it wasn't too disruptive. Thanks again.
Thank you, Rob. So much there. So many data points you've pointed to help people build that business case, I think, for this. And one thing that has become evident over the years is that people need to have a mindset shift to tackle this in the right way. And I think there was just so much in there that allowed people to start maybe thinking things in a different way than they might already be thinking of them, or to try and help convince other people, more importantly, to start thinking in a different way and why that's important and the impact it can have on the business. So I don't have any questions for you because I just thought that was a brilliant session. So I don't want to ruin it. So what we'll do is we'll package this up for on demand, and we'll probably try and edit out my my little bit and my anecdote. So we don't need me in there at all. So thank you so much. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, again, just to your point, it sometimes seems like there's really good takeaways or things on paper, but again, it does take mindset shift. Sometimes getting your rest of your organization a mindset shift as well. But again, if you can't launch it in your organization, as mentioned, try it with different teams to start seeing the impact and test it.
Yeah.
But again, it's also not easy, right? It's hard to change what you've been doing in the past or do something net new. But hopefully it came through that it's definitely worth it. If anyone wanted any more data or proof points on that, definitely let me know, or happy to connect in any other capacity. But no, nothing else from my end. Just a huge appreciation for what you and your team does. It's again, super purposeful, and usually I have a big passion statement on my chest as improve work lives. I wear it too much, so that one's in the wash. But I love what you're all doing there, inspiring workplaces, and just kind of happy to be in that community.
Yeah, I think I saw something with culture creators knocking around on LinkedIn as well. So I like that. I was going to ask where you got that from, whether I could have one. So, but no, thank you very much. So thank you to Rob and all of his insights that are always highly impressive and very, very helpful. And thank you to you for listening today. So, or if you're watching this on demand, thanks very much, and we'll be back again soon. Take care. Bye-bye.